Welcome to the interview series from DVA Germany, Dharma Voices for Animals Germany. This episode is focusing on the Tibetans and their relationship with veganism. I'm Yasmin from DVA, and we are thought that it might be a good idea to learn a little bit about the Tibetans and their culture and their religious view on meat eating, because a lot of Western Dharma practitioners and also German Dharma practitioners follow a Tibetan tradition. And we are very happy that we could find an expert on this topic. And that's our guest for today. It's Dr. Geoffrey Barstow. So, Geoffrey, first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview, and thanks for your precious time. And so Geoffrey, he is assistant professor of religious studies at Oregon State University. And his research focuses on the history and theory of vegetarianism in Tibet. And he's the author of a book with the title Food of Sinful Demons. It was published in 2018. And it's about the history of vegetarianism in pre-communist Tibet. And he's also the editor of the book The Falls of Meat. It came out in 2019. And this is a collection of Tibetan Buddhist writings on vegetarianism. So, Geoffrey, maybe you would like to introduce yourself a bit, and I would like to know why this research field is that much interesting for you, and how did you get in touch with Buddhism in the first place?
Well, thank you again, Yasmin, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. As for why this research topic, honestly, I think a lot of it was simply because there hadn't been a lot of research done on it, and I knew from many of my Tibetan friends and so on that this question of vegetarianism was a live issue, right? It was something that a lot of Tibetans and a lot of Western practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism were really interested in. Many of them were interested in being vegetarian or vegan, but then they also saw that a lot of the Tibetan lamas would eat meat. And so there was a sense that this idea of being vegetarian or vegan was, a lot of people thought it was this like a new thing, right? Something new, usually something that Westerners were going to bring in or impose on Tibetan culture, right? This wasn't a Tibetan Buddhist thing. And so that was what I had also assumed, right? Even as a vegetarian myself, I had assumed that this was not something that was traditionally part of Tibetan religious culture. But one day, then I was reading Patrul Rinpoche's Words My Perfect Teacher, the Kunzon Lama Shalom. And I saw some of his critiques of meat eating, and that just got me wondering, okay, maybe there's more of this out there. And then once I started looking, I realized quite quickly that actually there was a lot of discussion of meat eating and a lot of discussion of not eating meat in traditional pre-communist Tibetan literature. So that's where this project started, was this sense that the conventional wisdom, right, what both myself and a lot of others in the sort of the Western Buddhist community assumed was actually maybe incorrect, right? That it wasn't foreign to Tibetan religious culture to be concerned about eating meat, right? That this was actually something that many Tibetan religious leaders, lamas and geshes and khenpos, had been very concerned about and had written about fairly extensively. So that was the motivation for this project.
Yeah. Yeah, and I must say that I'm also very, very thankful that you did all this work, because this was also my question or my irritation, because I also thought that the Tibetan Lamas didn't care about this issue, and I'm happy to hear that they did, definitely. So so thanks for your work. And you also did some field work in Tibet, right? So how or when have you been there, or for how long?
Yeah, I mean, it's doing, doing field work in Tibet is complicated these days. We all understand that. So I spent, probably a total of a year and a half in Tibet over a series of visits, and yeah, so that was in the early 2010s, probably from like 2010 to 2012 was the most intense time when I was out there. But there's a lot of moving around. It's very difficult to spend a lot of time in one place. And so I did a lot of travel, visited a lot of small monasteries, and really all I was doing was everywhere I would go, I would ask people if they ate meat, what they thought about eating meat, just really often these very basic kinds of questions. And then also whenever I would be in a monastery, I was trying to collect texts, right? Because my interest was primarily the pre-communist period. I was only able to interview a few people who were old, right, and had actual living memory of that time. But I was very fortunate, and a lot of people, the Tibetans that I met were extremely kind. We had some really great discussions, and a lot of them also they're very interested in this topic, right? And so this was something also that a lot of my Tibetan friends were very interested in what I was finding, and so it's not at all unusual to spend a long time exchanging texts and talking about them with some of these monks and lamas and khenpos and geshes and all that. Yeah, so in some ways it was not really very traditional field work in that I wasn't able to spend a long time in one particular place. But I got to go to quite a few places and meet quite a few great people.
Yeah. So wonderful. Yeah, you've been in Tibet. I've never been there, so that's great. So yeah, then let's start with the first question that I have on your book.
Yeah.
So there is a chapter called "A Necessary Evil." So where you describe as meat eating as a necessary evil. And I would like to note beforehand that meat eaters all over the world justify their behavior by saying that killing animals is necessary because we humans have to eat meat for our health, for survival. And in the vast majority of cases, however, this justification is no longer tenable today. And therefore, I'm very skeptical at first when someone claims that in his or her country, it is not possible to eat purely plant-based food. And I think it is always worth asking again and to check if this is really true. So therefore, can you please explain to us why it was really difficult to eat vegetarian or even vegan in pre-communist Tibet?
Yeah, this is it's a really complicated question that I think in many ways really it cuts sort of to the heart of this question, right? That I've been researching and that we're talking about here. I think before I talk about the necessary evil idea, I want to step back a little bit and just reflect on some of the sort of the actual Buddhist arguments that people were making, right? Because if we're going to say if somebody's saying this is a necessary evil, we have to figure out why they're calling it evil, right? That may seem pretty straightforward, but we are talking about a culture where animal husbandry was one of the main sources of income, one of the main sources of sustenance. You know, nomads raise yaks and sheep. That's what they do, right? Without their animals, it's impossible to maintain that kind of a lifestyle. But the sort of the Buddhist arguments here, the Buddhist arguments against meat, really, they focus on just the simple idea of compassion, right? This recognition that in order to eat meat, the animal has to suffer, right? That in almost all cases, right? You know, say like normally, right? You slaughter an animal in order to eat its flesh. And there was a pretty clear and broad recognition across Tibetan culture that that act of killing caused the animal to suffer, right? It caused pain and harm. And that was something that was a problem, right? That this is, you know, religious leaders would point at this and be like, look, this is something that we shouldn't do, right? Some religious leaders, I won't say all of them, but there was a lot of religious teachers saying, look, this is not actually a good thing, right? It's not okay. We're causing pain, we're causing suffering. And we're supposed to be doing the opposite, right? The whole point of Buddhism, they would say, is to alleviate the suffering of sentient beings, not to cause more of it. And so that then now you've got, on the one hand, you've got a lot of people whose entire life is wrapped up in being a nomad, right? Raising yaks, raising sheep. And not all of the products that they get from those yaks and sheep are lethal, right? They also would sell the wool, for instance, or use the animals to help carry things like that. But a lot of what they get from these animals is meat for food, right? Either for food or often to trade to farmers. So there's that, but then there's also this other strand of Tibetan culture coming from the Buddhist side primarily, where you have people saying, but hold on, this is not really a good thing. And so what you ended up with, I think, was a lot of people who felt that, you know, okay, eating meat is a bad thing, right? But we have to do it anyway, right? Because if we don't have any way to sustain ourselves, right? Our entire nomadic lifestyle becomes impossible, and so on and so forth. So that's where this necessary evil idea comes in. It's like this sense that like eating this is regretful, it's unsustainable, right? Or it's not unsustainable, but it's unethical, right? But we need to, so we're stuck. Okay, that's a part of it. Another important part of the necessary side of things is that traditional Tibetan medicine often thought of meat as a sort of a necessary part of a healthy diet, right? And so according to traditional Tibetan medical conceptions, often people would say, like, if you don't eat meat, you're going to get weak, you're not going to be strong, you might get kind of jittery. And so there's a sense also from the medical side that meat was necessary, right? So these are all things, these kinds of conceptions, this idea that meat is unfortunate but necessary, right? Is something that I see a lot in the traditional Tibetan texts, right? Sometimes it's really explicit, sometimes it's less explicit, right? One of my favorite examples of this is a text by Sharza Tashi Gyaltsen. He's actually a Bonpo Lama from the early 20th century, and he writes for 4 pages about how evil meat is, right? And how it's terrible, and, you know, it's nauseating, and, you know, if you eat meat, you go to hell, and all of these things, right? He's really like this uncompromising position against meat. But then in the last few lines, he says, but we have to. Because if we don't, then we'll get weak and we won't be able to practice or teach the Dharma, right? So then he's like, so what's the solution? And he says that the solution is to eat meat that has died naturally, right? And so this is one of these sort of strategies that some of these lamas would propose as a way to get around this conundrum, right? This problem that they saw. And I will say, one last comment on this. When I first read this, I sort of thought that this was kind of unlikely, right? And then at some point, when I was in Tibet, I was talking with some nomads who said, oh no, like, a month ago we had a major lightning storm that killed 40 yaks in one night. And so that was where, they're like, this meat we're eating now, we didn't slaughter, right? This came from these animals that died in a lightning storm. Anyway, so this is one of the sort of ways that people try to navigate this this problem.
Yeah, as a strategy to overcome this problem with the meat. But what I think is important to explain to our audience is that as I understood it, is that in Tibet it's very difficult to grow vegetables, right, due to the high altitude. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. I sometimes it is true, and I've definitely heard a lot of Tibetans talk about how difficult it is, or it was, to eat vegetables, to get vegetables. At the same time, I think we need to be also kind of realistic about how much meat people were actually eating, right? This idea that maybe Tibetans were eating meat all the time, every day, is actually, I think, not actually true. At least not all Tibetans, right? Some may have been, right? Particularly nomads in more remote regions, that was a pretty meat-heavy diet. But even for a lot of nomads, the pattern, they would often slaughter in the fall and then eat the meat through the fall and through the winter. But by spring, the meat would actually be getting used up. And so they would eat other things, like primarily tsampa, right? Yeah. The main non-meat food that for most Tibetans is tsampa, it's barley, right? And so they roast the barley and then it's ground into a flour. And in many ways, that's much more of a staple, or was much more of a staple than meat was. It's hard to get a sense from texts about what people actually ate on like a daily basis, because that's not something people wrote down. But I've seen a few references that make me think that for average people, right, people who weren't wealthy, people who weren't, these really high-ranking lamas, meat might have been something they might have eaten a little bit of a couple of times a week. But for a lot of them, it wasn't every day. And so you're already in a situation where they're not eating a ton of meat, right? It's there. It's an important part of the diet, or they consider it to be an important part of the diet. But it's not that, like, in terms of like the number of calories that most people would have been consuming, it wouldn't have been necessarily that huge a percentage. So really, I mean, the main staple is tsampa.
Yeah, so that's what I also heard, that the main things that they had to eat was meat from their yaks, this tsampa and butter.
The butter is important, and it's there's a lot of dairy that would get consumed, particularly in the form of butter, and in drunken tea, sometimes just eaten as like a spoonful of butter. But that's also a really important source of calories for people.
Yeah. So I think, so the Tibetans really had good reasons to eat animal flesh, because if you do not have an alternative, so then what to do? But just one comment on the point of the Tibetan medicine. I do not want to go deeper into it, but just to mention that this can also happen in Germany. I mean, if you go to the doctor and the worst thing that you can do is to mention that you are vegan, because then suddenly all of your health problems are related to your vegan diet. So, yeah. But
it's something that is worldwide, right? It's particularly the association of meat with strength, right? Physical strength. It's definitely something that you'll see all over the place.
Okay, so then maybe let's go on to my second question. So it's about culture. And Tibet, of course, does not only consist of Buddhism, but also of culture. And as in all countries of the world, meat food is deeply rooted in the culture and also in the economy, as you've explained before, that people have been nomads and were dependent on their yaks. So, but when we talk about the culture, so can you give us an overview of the main aspects? So what do the Tibetan associate with meat eating? So strength, you already mentioned strength. Can you go deeper into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think meat gets wrapped up with a lot of aspects of society, right? And it's not just a question of food, right? It gets pulled into all kinds of other things. It becomes, having a lot of meat, meat was often more expensive. And so having or eating a lot of meat would be a sign of wealth, right? And so a way of sort of, almost like, I don't want to say showing off, but like demonstrating and, that you were successful, right? Would be to have a big feast with lots of meat, right? Or if you want to offer good things to the Lama, you might offer them meat to eat because this was more prestigious, right? Than just sampa. And so it gets wrapped up in things in a lot of ways. And this sense of meat being a source of physical strength is also, it's a big thing, and it permeates out. And so you get a sense that from people of, oh, if I don't do this, then I won't be able to work, right? I won't be able to, if I don't eat this, I won't be able to work my fields. If I don't eat this, I won't be able to travel. I won't be able to trade, all of these things. So I think it's, when we're talking about culture, we're talking about something really complicated here and with a lot of facets. And, as from a researcher's perspective, it's really fascinating how deeply this question of meat eating or not meat eating pervades into other aspects of life. And another thing that I think we see around the world, like I've talked with lots of Tibetans who they're like, yeah, I'm vegetarian or something like that. But then when I go home, my mother really wants me to eat meat, right? Like, so it's really hard to say no. And then I talk to people in the US and they're saying the same thing. It's right, so I want to be vegetarian, but then I go home for Thanksgiving or I go home for Christmas and, and so there's a lot of pressures on people, right? This is not just a question of like an individual making an individual choice, right? It's an individual making a choice within this really complicated web of tensions and being pulled in lots of different directions. And social pressure is part of it. The desire to be strong is part of it. The desire to appear strong is part of it, right? And all of these things, right? And there's also, the simple fact that, for most of the Tibetans I've spoken to, they think meat tastes good, right? So there's also this sense of personal pleasure here. All of that being pushed against these Buddhist conceptions that eating meat is morally wrong, right? Or unethical, or just bad in, in one of these ways. And so really, if there's one thing that I've like pulled from these interviews that I've done with people and these texts is that, people felt caught. People felt like they were being pulled in multiple directions. And even if they wanted, to be really strict vegetarians, there were other causes pulling them in other directions there. So they might have found it very difficult to, either for practical reasons or for cultural reasons, right? Social reasons. So people felt, there's a real sense that people are being pulled in multiple directions, right? So for some people that ends up meaning that they're not vegetarian, right? I mean, one of the things that I think is remarkable though about the Tibetan tradition here is that there were actually quite a number of people who, for religious reasons, did stop eating meat, right? This is not at all unheard of. I think the last time I counted, I've got records of more than 100 individual lamas. So 100 individual religious leaders who were vegetarian, right? And that doesn't sound like a really big number, right? Out of all the millions of Tibetans, but I mean, these are the only ones that we have records of, right? There were a lot of others who we don't have biographies, who didn't write records, right? Nobody ever did a survey in pre-communist Tibet, right? Nobody ever like went around and said, 33% of the population doesn't eat meat.
Yeah, of course.
One of I mentioned before that I've done a couple of interviews with older lamas who do remember the pre-communist era. And one of the things that's remarkable is that they describe vegetarianism as actually a relatively common thing, right? That particularly in monastic communities, there would be a large portion of the monks who were vegetarian, right? And they were like, it was some people weren't. But it was, at least in like Eastern Tibet in the early 20th century, which is where most of these people were, it wasn't at all unheard of. And so when we think about all of the different cultural things sort of pushing back against vegetarianism, it's kind of remarkable that it was as popular as it was.
Yeah, I also think that under these circumstances, it's really remarkable. So, and I didn't know about it. So, but you've also explained that there is a connection between, for example, hunting and masculinity. Can you say something about this?
Yeah. I mean, this is something also that's not unique to Tibet, right? This connection between violence and strength and hunting and violence against humans, but also violence against animals as a way of sort of projecting and demonstrating and reinforcing an individual's masculine identity, right? Their sense of like being strong, right? Their sense of being physically strong, of being physically capable. This is an important part of a lot of people's self-conception. And yeah, in Tibetan culture as well as in other cultures, right? And there, some of this is not just about meat eating. We also see this in, some of these sort of competitions, whether it's horse racing or archery or these kinds of things that we see in Tibetan culture, where these are competitions between people trying to sort of show off or demonstrate this sort of masculine warrior identity, and meat eating was part of that. And so it there was a sense that if you were or you wanted to be this sort of strong warrior, you ate meat.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. Yeah, and I think so meat eating is also about domination, right? So if you are able to show dominance over a weaker, in this case, an animal, and yeah, so I can just only say that everybody who listens can ask this question. So what matters more? So being considered masculine or having some courage to protect the weaker, so in this case innocent animals, right? Yeah. Okay, so maybe let's go to the next point. So based on the fact that it was almost impossible to eat a purely plant-based diet without being at the verge of starvation, yeah, and based on the Tibetan way of life as nomads and cattle farmers. So many lamas have developed a number of creative, rhetorical, and practical strategies to enable their students to still meet the demands of ethical behavior to a certain degree, and to give them the chance to cultivate compassion for the animals. So can you give us an overview of these different strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing that's important to think about here, or to recognize here, is that this isn't for honestly almost all of the Tibetans that I'm familiar with that wrote about this. Even the ones who were very strong in favor of vegetarianism, it was never, or was almost never, an absolute thing. Like never under any circumstances ever. There was, it's much more fluid than that, much more shifting. And so the general sense was like, look, killing animals for their meat is bad, right? So the less you kill, the better, right? The less death that you cause, the better. And so these strategies would be ways to reduce the harm, right? Reduce the amount of harm that is caused, even if somebody doesn't feel like they can completely eliminate it, right? And so some of these strategies, were actually really simple, like eat less meat, right? That might be all of it. The entire strategy right there is just to say, to try to cut back. Instead of taking 2 helpings, just take 1, right? And then you're not cutting it off completely, but you are reducing, right? Other strategies would be to not eat any meat during like particularly holy days, right? For instance, the month of Sagadawa, the holiday of Sagadawa, is often people will often be vegetarian for Sagadawa. Let's see, other strategies are, I think, in some ways more creative, if less, not necessarily practical. Like one of my, I think the most interesting ones is this practice of reciting a prayer before eating meat. And so the idea here is that someone who is going to eat meat, before they eat it, would recite a prayer for the benefit of the animal, right? So the idea is that they recite this prayer, and then that will improve what happens to the animal, right? And I've got, there are several of these prayers that are going around. And so this doesn't actually reduce, at least in theory, it doesn't reduce the number of dead animals, right? It doesn't actually reduce the suffering that that eating meat causes. But what it does do is every time that this person is going to recite this, and so the thing is, some of these prayers are not short, right? Some of these are like 4, 5, 10 pages long. It'll take you a couple of minutes to recite this, which means that every time you eat meat, you're reflecting on the negativity of what you're doing, right? And even if it's just stays like that as a reflection, it's still an acknowledgement of meat eating as a morally bad choice, right? Or a morally bad act, right? It's an acknowledgement that what you're doing is causing suffering. It's a refusal to just sweep it under the rug and ignore it, right? And so even these kinds of strategies that don't necessarily have like a practical impact on in terms of like the number of dead animals, have an impact on attitudes and how people approach that and what they think about that. And to my mind, that's actually the biggest thing here, right? In terms of like the overall goal of reducing, reducing the number of deaths, the more people think, the more they reflect on it, the more likely they are to then next time make a different choice, right? And so I think a lot of these strategies that these lamas came up with are actually really astute and, sometimes I think really psychologically creative, right? This, particularly again, these prayers, right? This whole thing. So I think, it's really what it was an attempt to reduce the amount of death that was being caused, right? The amount of animal death. And so the strategies, or whatever anyone can do to reduce that, the better. In some ways, I'm reminded, I don't know if they have this in Germany. In the US, there's this thing they sometimes promote called Meatless Monday, right? Which is the idea that, one day a week, just on Mondays, right? One day a week, you can be vegetarian. And on the one hand, that's kind of like, okay, but it's not really that big, one day. But it really, I think it also, if someone adheres to that, it's part of this process, right? It's part of this process of reducing and eventually, hopefully, eliminating these deaths, right? And the suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I also heard as a strategy from a lama is please eat only big animals and instead of small animals. So eat cow instead of chicken, because then this is also a reduction of the death.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. In some ways, it's the opposite of at least how it is in the US, I imagine, in Germany. In the US, you have a lot of people who will give up red meat, right? They'll give up beef first, but they still eat fish and chicken. And for a lot of Tibetans, it's the exact opposite, right? You should give up the fish and chicken first, and then if then you can get rid of the yak or the larger animals, right? So yeah.
Yeah, so I think that what we can see here, what the lamas do, is the so-called reductionary approach, which we have also as animal rights activists. And I think that due to the living conditions in pre-communist Tibet, these kind of strategies of reducing are really justified and they are skillful. Yeah, but I think that what I see is how people here in the West react when Tibetan lamas come up with these strategies. And I also see friends who say a mantra before they eat their schnitzel. and that's the critical point. But yeah, so that's the question, if these strategies are, in our case, useful or more destructive. So, but I think it's this is a topic for an extra interview where I could really talk for hours about this. Yeah, but I think it's very useful to hear about these strategies and what is the intention, yeah, and under the conditions that they had in Tibet, yeah.
Yeah, I think I will say for myself, I want to be very careful about telling people or making judgments, right, about what others, particularly from other cultures, do. But I think the intention here is clear, right? And the intention with this is to reduce suffering. And that intention, it's hard. I feel like it's hard to come up with reasons to not get behind that, right? To not support that intention. And how exactly someone does it in Tibet is going to be different than how someone does it in Germany or the United States, right? But this overall goal of reducing suffering as much as you can around you in the world.
Yeah.
It's hard
yeah,
to...
but I just simply think that as a Dharma practitioner here in Germany, if you say mantra before eating meat, it does not reduce the suffering. You just simply leave it out from your diet. So it is just more a strategy to get rid of your bad conscience, right? So. Yeah, okay, so then I've got the next question. So based on the fact that it was indeed extremely difficult to survive in Tibet without eating animals, it is understandable that it was not easy to follow the ethical guidelines of Buddhism. And nevertheless, I was pleasantly surprised to see that there have been outstanding Tibetan lamas in history, and you already mentioned this, who have spoken out in favor of a plant-based form of nutrition, or at least they have lived it consistently for themselves and almost ascetically. So if they didn't ask their students to adopt a vegetarian diet, but they did it for themselves. So can you just name some of those lamas? So from which Buddhist schools did they come from? Was it a special Buddhist school or different Buddhist schools? And how did they live?
Yeah, I mean, I could name a lot of them. They came from all schools, right? And, you know, there are quite a few. So just sort of to run down some prime examples, quite a few of the early Kagyu lamas were vegetarian, and lamas in Pagmadrupa's circle. Many of the Karmapa hierarchs were vegetarian. There were quite a few vegetarian Sakya masters. Quite a few Nyingma lamas were vegetarian. Vegetarianism was particularly strong in Bon, among Bon lamas. And there were also quite a few Geluk figures who were vegetarian, right? It's across the board. There were also plenty who weren't, right? So I want to, make sure I'm not giving the impression that all lamas were vegetarian. There were quite a few who were. There were also plenty who weren't. It kind of, one of the things that I noticed sort of looking at historical patterns is that there are sort of waves of popularity with vegetarianism. And one of them really, starts sort of with the beginning of what we would call like the second dissemination in like the 11th, 12th century, particularly among the early Kagyu lamas. And that really, it grows, and it stays, as far as I can tell, pretty common up until like the 15th or the 16th century, right? And by that point, it seems like it's fading. Let's see. Then sort of starting again then in like the early 19th century, you get another sort of wave of vegetarianism, particularly in Eastern Tibet. And so this time, whereas in the first round, it was, possibly centered more with the Kagyu and the Sakya, this one is, I think of as being particularly associated with Nyingma and Bon in Eastern Tibet. And again, you just get sort of my sense is honestly by the early 20th century, for much of the history of vegetarianism in Tibet, being vegetarian was like, it was a thing. And if you were vegetarian, that was a sign of your, that you were really like a strong practitioner, right? That you were really interested in religion. And one of the things that's remarkable is that by the early 20th century, it almost looks like it's become so common that it's not so remarkable anymore, right? That there were enough vegetarians in the early 20th century in Eastern Tibet that it stops being mentioned as much in like biographies. It's not held up in as much as like, oh, see, this person is so special, they were even a vegetarian, right? It just sort of becomes more normal. And so, yeah, there were these sort of waves across Tibetan history, times and places where it was more popular, and times and places when it wasn't as popular. We have rule books for some monasteries that are very clear that you're not allowed, if you're a monk at this monastery, you're not allowed to eat meat, right? And then we have other rule books for other monasteries that are very clear that, sure, go for it, right? So it's hard to say it was all one or all another. But it came and went, and it was very time and place dependent. And it also, I think it depended a lot on charismatic lamas and powerful, important lamas who would institute rules and practices. I think a great example is Ngorchen Kunguzangpo, this foundational figure for the Ngor Sankhya. And so, he was himself a vegetarian, and when he founded Ngor Monastery, he created really strong rules about vegetarianism. And so Ngor became a hotbed of vegetarianism for centuries, right? And then it faded. And so, 500 years later, we have records of the monks eating a lot of meat at Ngor. So it's not it doesn't always persist, right? But you definitely have sort of times and places where it was really strong and really common and a really major thing, and other places when it wasn't.
Yeah, I think that people need role models, right? So they just need it. So I remember Yatsuna Tenzin Palmo in one of her teachings when she said, if the Lama eats meat, the students eat meat. And if the Lama is vegetarian, the students are vegetarian. So students are like sheep. So they just look what the Lama does and they follow. Yeah. But I must say that I was really touched by their stories, because I think it must have been hard for them to really stay consistently with Buddha's teachings on nonviolence. And I think that they really showed their deep devotion to the Dharma, to stay with the vegetarian diet under these circumstances. So
yeah, I think, I'm going to tell a story, and I don't have my notes up, and I can't remember the Lama that had this happen. But there's, in the end of his biography, he was a lifelong vegetarian. It's clearly important to him, promoted it, and at the end he's dying, and the doctor says, if you drink this soup made out of the powdered lungs of a wild yak, right, as medicine, you'll get better. And he says, nope. And he refuses, right? And he dies soon thereafter, right? So, there are stories out there about really kind of heroic adherence to vegetarianism as an ideal. So.
Yeah, that's true. You have to be very strong and devoted to really say, no, it's no problem if I die. I won't I won't take the meat.
That's a level that I think, that is hard to attain.
Yeah. Okay. So, but we also need to talk about the critical points. So you also told that there were also lamas who, and I must say that I still find this very contradictory and repulsive, who, on the contrary, even found religious arguments, if I understood this right, for meat consumption. So can you give an example and talk about the arguments?
There are two main streams of two main types of argument, I think, that support meat eating. The first is based in the Vinaya, and the Vinaya being the rules for monks and nuns. And so in these rules, the rule surrounding meat eating says that you can eat meat if it has threefold purity. And what threefold purity means is that you have to, you can't have seen that somebody killed it specifically for you. You can't have heard that someone killed this animal specifically for you. And you can't even suspect that somebody killed the animal specifically for you, right? And so this is the rule, right? And that is found in the rules for monks and nuns. And it's a rule that allows meat eating as long as the meat was not killed specifically for, as long as you don't know that the meat was killed specifically for you. And so a good example, like a good way to think about this, like if you imagine a monk, particularly on like a begging round, when they would go out begging, they might show up at someone's house unannounced. The householder had no idea that the monk was coming. The householder has cooked themselves some dinner or some breakfast, because the monks probably are not eating in the evening. So the householder has cooked themselves some breakfast and there's some meat in it. The monk shows up, the householder just gives some of the food that they've got, puts it in the monk's bowl, and the monk leaves, right? According to the rules, that meat would be acceptable because the monk had no role in promoting or causing the death of the animal. On the flip side, if the householder says, oh, hey, come back tomorrow, what would you like? And the monk says, oh, I'd really like some meat. Then the householder, they come back the next day, the householder gives them meat. That violates the rule of threefold purity, right? That is meat that the monk knows was killed and prepared specifically for them. And so in that case, they would not be allowed to eat the meat, right? So that's sort of I'd say like a basic kind of understanding of the rule of threefold purity. And it was the subject of a lot of debate among Tibetan Buddhists, right? Tibetan Buddhism as a tradition, intellectually has been described as scholasticism, which means that there's a lot of debate over what do the texts mean? What does the text, like what is it really talking about, right? And so there's a lot of debate over this rule. And some lamas felt that what the rule meant was that it was okay to eat meat as long as it had been killed by someone else, right? For instance, a butcher. So if you go into the shop in your village and you buy meat from a butcher, chances are that that meat was not killed specifically for you as an individual. It was killed for sale, right? But it was not killed for that individual monk. And so for some Tibetan lamas, that meant that meat had threefold purity and it was okay to eat it. Other lamas disagreed, right? And so other lamas would point to this and say, look, okay, maybe that's like the letter of the law, but the spirit here is that, you're not supposed to contribute to the death of the animals. And if all the monks from the monastery are going into the village, the butcher's going to kill more, right? And so there was debate. Let's just put it that way, right? There was a lot of debate between individual lamas and also between different schools on how to interpret the rule of threefold purity. But some lamas definitely did point to the rule of threefold purity and say, see, therefore it's okay for us to eat meat as long as we didn't kill it ourselves, or as long as we don't go to the butcher and say, kill me a yak, I'm going to buy it tomorrow, right? If you do that, then that was against the rules. So that's one argument that some lamas would use to support meat eating. Another one that sometimes comes up involves Tantra, and this idea that being a tantric practitioner is so powerful that it makes you such a powerful person that by eating the meat of the animal, you are benefiting that animal by creating a connection between you and the animal, right? And so some lamas said things like this and said that, therefore it's totally fine to eat meat, and so on and so forth. And obviously, other lamas disagreed, right? One of the classic responses to this is to say something like, okay, well, if you're really that powerful a tantric practitioner, you should be able to bring the animal back to life. So if you can bring the animal back to life after you eat it, then okay. But otherwise, nope, right? And so you get some really high-level lamas saying things like, I can't do this. So, probably you all, my students, looking at their students, probably you guys can't either, right? So again, this was a point of debate, right? It was, some lamas would propose this idea of creating a tantric connection with the animal, and others would disagree, and others would say, no, that's not how it works. So there's no, it's not like here's a clear argument, right? It's a point of debate.
Yeah, so it's also about the alms bowl excuse, as I call it. And I think we just simply have to think what was the intention of the Buddha to make this rule. And I think his intention was that no additional animal should be killed for the food of the Sangha. And so I think this is the main point here. So, and
that's certainly one of the big interpretations, right? But it's not the only one that was out there. So yeah.
Okay. So then I have one question about language. So what was really new for me to hear? So I don't speak Tibetan, and therefore it was very interesting to read that there is no word for vegetarian or vegan in the Tibetan language. So can you explain how the Tibetans describe plant-based food?
Yeah, it's not quite correct to say that there's not a word for it. There is now, right? But it's a relatively new word that we don't see very often in older Tibetan texts. And that's this word karse. Means like white food. And then karsepa, meaning someone who eats white food, is a vegetarian. So these days that's in wide use. But it doesn't have a lot of, doesn't seem to have been used a lot previously. There's also a term used particularly in some Sakya sources called dokar, and that also would signify a vegetarian diet, but it wasn't like, it just really wasn't all that widespread. What's much more common is to simply read in a text a phrase that would say something along the lines of like, so-and-so, after their 18th birthday, they stopped eating meat, right? Or they never ate meat again, right? So it's not, the thing to me that I think is interesting about this is that instead of having like a set defined diet like we might have, right? We think of vegetarianism means this, veganism means this, pescatarianism means this. They would say, I'm not going to eat this thing anymore, right? And so it's instead of adopting this known diet, it's more about a rejection of a specific type of food, right? And so it's less about adopting something and more about giving up something. Which I think it's an interesting sort of way of it having how the language works, right? And I think it points to, I think there's a number of things we can take from it. One of the interesting ones I think is, like I was talking before about those strategies, I think it points to really an emphasis on the problem is the eating of the meat. And so whatever is done to reduce that, is good, right?
Yeah. Also read this term white food, but I didn't know what it means, so I didn't really, understand that it means okay, please eat vegetarian. So that's
it means
that's interesting.
It's held up in opposition to red food. right? I've seen restaurants these days where you go in and you get a menu and it's got red food on one side and white food on the other, and the red food is pretty clear, right? Where the color coding comes from, and so the white food is food that is not red.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, and but now we've talked a lot about the past, but I think we should also talk about the present days. And yeah, what I would like to know is what are the current living conditions in Tibet? So I have heard, but I've never been in Tibet, that nowadays food is also imported from abroad. And therefore, it is theoretically possible to eat vegan food without any problems. However, you wrote in your book, and I really had to laugh about it, that it can even happen that people feed those imported vegetables to the animals because they obviously don't know that the vegetables are also eatable for us humans. So can you
I think that was a specific story that I heard, but that doesn't happen these days, right? That was about a while ago. I mean, these days there's a lot of food, a lot of varieties of food available in Tibetan areas, right? And it gets trucked up from China. There are also greenhouses now that will grow vegetables locally. And Chinese food is also widely available. And so Tibetans have become more accustomed to eating vegetables because it's something that's now out there in the milieu, is that this is like a normal part of the diet, right? These things that maybe didn't exist as much before. At the same time, I think on the flip side, there's other pressures going on. And, I'm thinking of the fact that, nomadism and these other aspects of Tibetan culture are really under pressure from the government and modernity, but really specific government policies designed to make these kinds of traditional Tibetan lifestyles impossible. And so, on the one hand, it's more practically easy probably to be vegetarian or vegan than it used to be. But it's also this aspect of culture that people want to preserve and is under threat, right? Is the nomadism. And so, again, there's a tension there between this sort of desire to preserve nomadism, nomadic identity, and this desire to uphold what people understand to be sort of good Buddhist teachings, right, by avoiding meat. And it's become a fairly controversial topic, with some people, particularly some lamas, being really proponents of vegetarianism, and other people really pushing back, not passively, right? So not just saying like, oh, do whatever you want, but saying, no, you should not be vegetarian, right? If you're vegetarian, that only makes it harder for nomads. And so don't do that. And so in contemporary Tibet, it's a point of almost conflict, right? Definitely a point of tension. And I will say I haven't really, it's been now several years since I've been spent much time in the area. So things may have changed. The situation may have changed on the ground. I don't actually, I'm not super up to date on that.
Yeah. So yeah, what you wrote in your book is that we can even talk about a vegan movement. Yeah. So that vegetarianism has become very widespread on the one hand. But as you mentioned, at the same time, However, there is a so far unknown defensive attitude against vegetarianism, right? What you said. And so I would also like to understand this, what is the problem here. But however, I would like to stress also that everywhere where veganism booms in the world, at the same time, the resistance increases. So this is what we can see. So because we vegans, we are finally a serious threat to the dominant carnistic system, which is a belief system. So we will make another interview to explain this more closely, which means that belief that meat eating is normal, necessary, and natural. And also we are a kind of threat to the profits of the animal industry. So for example, while it was no problem at all for me back in the 90s to eat vegetarian, so nobody noticed it. But today, I can hardly sit at the table without at least hearing some jokes about vegetarianism. So it is thus clearly noticeable that the pressure on people to change is increasing because veganism is now visible all the time and everywhere. So in this respect, this is also not special for Tibetan, for Tibet. But I think that in Tibet, of course, we have a very special situation. And what I would like to know is to what extent does the identification of the Tibetans as nomads and as cattle farmers stand in the way of the vegan movement? Yeah, and also if it could be also a kind of uprooting, and maybe also if the Tibetans would like to push back the influence of the Chinese and save their culture. So can you say something about it?
I mean, I take your point about how, this is a pattern that we see in lots of places, right? But I do think that the situation in Tibet is different. And I think about, like in the US, I can't speak for Germany, like the cattle industry is not under serious threat, right? They're not really in danger of going out of business anytime soon. But in Tibet, like there's a real possibility that the nomadic lifestyle won't survive one more generation, right? And that's not just because of the vegetarian movement, right? I mean, I suspect that the vegetarian movement is a relatively small part of that, but for all kinds of reasons, it's it's being sort of, there are active policies being implemented to make it difficult, if not impossible, to remain as a nomad. And so I think there's a real sense of this aspect of Tibetan life and Tibetan culture being under threat. And so I don't want to downplay that. I want to make sure that we remember that this is it is an important part of Tibetan self-conception, right? And how Tibetans see themselves. And so, is it a impediment to the rise of the vegetarian movement? Yeah, right. And that's a position that Tibetans themselves are going to have to navigate, right? Again, I'm not going to sit here and say what they should or shouldn't do, but it's absolutely becoming a point of tension in contemporary Tibetan society. And I've spoken with a lot of Tibetans who feel very conflicted and who don't know how to do both, right? They want to be vegetarian, they want to support this movement, but they also want to have nomads in Tibet 20 years from now, right? And 20 years is not a long time, right? And they don't know how that works. They don't know how to do both of those. And so, yeah, it's I think a point of significant tension and a difficulty for people. And, different Tibetans I've spoken to respond to that difficulty in different ways. But I think it's a very different situation than we find in the US. And again, I can't speak for Germany, but I imagine Germany is closer to the US than it is to the Tibetan context. Where in the US, there's not realistic threat, like the ranching industry is not going to disappear within 20 years. And so I think that, in the US, I find myself in a very different context than the Tibetans that I know do. And so the questions are simpler in many ways for me than they are for my Tibetan friends. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, understand that this is, it's a conflict, right? That's really, really not easy. And I would never ever do a judgment about it as a German. And yeah, wonderful. Is there something else you would like to add?
Ooh. I think I don't have a lot to add right now. I think, you had some really great questions, and I appreciate them. And I think we've really enjoyed this conversation. Yeah. So I'll just add, thank you again for having me on and for having this conversation. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and yeah.
Yeah, so thank you, Geoffrey. It was a pleasure to talk with you, and I think it was a very interesting interview. And maybe I would like to say something about your book again. So the title is Food of Sinful Demons. And for me, it was really eye-opening, because the behavior of the Tibetan lamas here in Europe when they come for a visit with regard to meat is, for me as a Westerner and as a vegan and an animal rights activist, sometimes really strange, and it's hard for me to understand it, but your book was really helpful. So thanks for your work. And what I also want to say is your book is a scientific work, yes, but it is written in an understandable language. So even I, as a non-academic, was able to read it. So therefore, I can really recommend it to our audience to read this book. So
that's great to hear. I will say, when I wrote it, I tried to write it in a way that would be understandable, and so it's great to hear.
Yeah, it shouldn't stay in the library. It should be read by the people.